so my name is Jill Flegel, and I am actually the Director of Faculty Staff Disability Services at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. I've been in that position for over 21 years. I am incredibly blessed to have that position, and I know it, and believe me, I do not take that for granted. It's my dream job, and I get to continue to do it, hopefully, for the rest of my working career. I hope this will be a week of education and revelation, and a week of inclusion, and of course, a week of celebration for everybody. I want it to be a week that we look back to remember, but most importantly, that we look forward, and that moves us forward in the coming months and years, and the rights and realities that still need to be addressed. A little bit about me. My own journey began 41 years ago. This is where the weepy part comes in. I had a spinal cord injury in 1979. I was 14 years old, and it was before there was anything like the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And very much like the speaker we heard earlier, my family was told not to take me home because it wouldn't work. There was no school. They wouldn't be able to care for me. It would probably cause a divorce, many things. But they took me home anyway. What did they know? What we didn't know was a lot. So from the age of 14 on, I've used a power chair. And I quickly found out how inclusive the world I was living in really was, or rather how inclusive the world I was living in was not. The high school that I was attending was not accessible. The restaurants where I wanted to eat were not accessible. The movie theater I wanted to go to with my friends was sort of accessible. The church that I worshiped at with my family was not accessible. And the college that I wanted to go to further my education was kind of accessible. Very few places were truly wheelchair accessible. So I started to get involved with this new idea, this movement that I heard about. And in 1988, I heard about a gentleman named Justin Dart. And I said, who is this guy? Now, this is before the internet and before, it was just kind of word of mouth, and we'd get some letters once in a while from the League of Human Dignity, say. And they talked about a bunch of people going to Omaha to speak on behalf of people with disabilities. And so my friend Jane Pickle and I decided we were going to do this. Very brave. I mean, Jane is also quadriplegic, drove a van at the time, and we took off, on an adventure. And we went to Omaha, and we wrote out our testimony for Justin Dart, a little paragraph talking about why we felt discriminated against. He was touring the United States and generating support for this new idea, this inclusion and equal opportunities for people with disabilities. This thing we now know as the ADA. Civil rights legislation. Think about that. Civil rights legislation that any American could require at any point in their life, no matter how young, no matter how old. So it's still several years after that. And I was out of college, didn't really think about it very much. And all of a sudden I was out trying to find a job, and I was being discriminated against. People didn't want to hire me, even though I had a college degree. I had done very well in high school. I thought I was a good worker. I had college experience at a job, but nobody wanted to hire me. And in fact, they were trying to put me into jobs that were, in my mind, below what I could do. And then in 1990, in July of 1990, of course, which is why we're here, and celebrating and raising awareness, the ADA was signed. And it's not like it turned the switch and everything changed automatically, but it made people start to think. And we started hearing this phrase, or had been hearing this phrase, nothing about us without us. And it was a chant that echoes on even today. And although things have changed, and we certainly have more accessibility and better representation than we had 30 years ago, we certainly still have a long way to go. And I always say, when people say, what do you want to change the most? And I say attitudes, because until attitudes change, then things for people with disabilities aren't really going to change. And until people truly believe that a person with a disability can do anything that a person without a disability can do, then we don't have true equality. And equal opportunity has been our goal, and it continues to be our goal. And the true community inclusion, that's not too much to ask for. People with disabilities should have the right to go anywhere we want to go. The ability to travel, the ability to apply for jobs, to worship, to enjoy entertainment venues, to not go through the back door, to not sit in the worst seats in the venue. So many brave people have started this fight, and the woman who we saw speaking earlier certainly was one of them. And we've joined our voices together before, and we've joined our hearts, and we've joined our presence together. And they've started a fight, and we need to keep it going. So small things can start, like a single paragraph written in 1988 by a young college girl with a dream in her heart. But it's up to all of us and all of you, to keep this movement going, to keep these wheels turning, so to speak. We all deserve the chance for equal opportunity. So let's keep changing those attitudes. And thank you so much, Kathy, for asking me to speak today. And I hope you all have a great week celebrating the 30th anniversary of the ADA. Thank you.
There's a comment.
I have to unmute myself. So much, Jill. What Jill didn't tell you is I can be kind of a nerdy person at times. And I was going through the archives from Justin Dart when he passed away. And I found that paragraph Jill wrote.
I have it. Yes, I have it.
And yeah, because I sent it to her. So, you know, the thing is, no matter how big or how small whatever you do is, and it can have so much power.
Comment from the chat room. Mark Smith says, Justin Dart was a transformational leader. His wife, Yoshiko, is continuing his work. He was sitting next to the president at the ADA signing in the cowboy hat. He was big on wearing cowboy hats and boots.
Yes.
Megan says, awareness via education and training helps build empathy and are the first steps to changing attitudes. And Dee said, thank you, Jill.
Absolutely.
Let's see. Mark Smith is virtually clapping for you.
Thank you.
Sarvina says, thank you. And Dee says, kind of. Amen.
Thank you. And I want to end on one last note. And this is a quote from, I don't know if you know, he's a disabled performance artist named Neil Marcus. And this is one of the quotes I almost always include when I speak, and I almost missed it because it was the end here. But he says, disability is not a brave struggle or courage in the face of adversity. Disability is an art. It's an ingenious way to live. And I believe that.
That is so true, Jill. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay, now, let's see if we can figure this out. Kim Davis is supposed to be our next speaker, and she'll be using one of our interpreters as her voice. So I hope we get this to work. I'll let you introduce yourself, Kim.
Okay. Kim, you need to put on your mic, on your camera.
Kim has her camera on.
I'm unmuting.
Why
Kim
does
needs-
Kim need to
Kim-
unmute?
Kim was on mute.
Well, Kim can leave it on mute. Just the interpreter needs it off mute.
Yeah.
Because I'm depending on Hannah or one of the interpreters' voice. For my beautiful voice, I'll be using the interpreter. So my hands are like my beautiful voice, but you'll be hearing the interpreter. So my first name is Kim. My last name is Davis. And I work for the Nebraska Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. And I work as an advocate. And that's really kind of where my heart is. And also, can we hold on just one second? I have to figure out how to make your picture bigger. Okay. You said, so we're going to start back at, you work for Nebraska Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, you're an advocate. Yep, and I work as an advocate specialist there for the Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. Like I said, that's really where my heart is. It's really a perfect fit for me. And that's just, and then also being knowledgeable with the ADA and working for an advocate. And I've been doing that for many deaf and hard of hearing individuals and deaf blind individuals as well, many groups. And I've been providing different educational services as a specialist. And then also doing some legislative work as well and providing resources. Yeah, keep going. And also just providing resources and benefits, I guess, to the community, and just providing services again for the deaf, blind, and deaf and hard of hearing individuals throughout the community. So obviously I'm a deaf individual and I was born deaf. And really during that time, I was obviously born prior to when the ADA was passed, and my father was actually in the military at that time when I was born. And he was actually in Turkey. So my mother is American, but I was actually born in Turkey. And so we came back when I was about 3.5. My parents had found out that I was deaf at that time or around that time. And, I was able to speak some words, but it just was not like regular. It wasn't what you consider quote unquote normal. I had an older sister who they would kind of compare that to, and they were doing some testing at some point and eventually found out that I was deaf. So during that time, let me backtrack. So many people were actually born because, or many people had contracted measles or rubella. My mother was actually not Your mother was not exposed. My mother was actually not exposed to that, but many people were exposed to that. Turkey actually did not have the same kind of impact or have the same kind of exposure as what the U.S. had with rubella and measles and diseases of that sort. So sometimes pregnant mothers, if they are exposed to rubella, that can actually cause illness for the fetus, and that can cause, I guess, other issues when the fetus is actually born. So, and at that time, they weren't really able to tell you if, so there wasn't necessarily a test. You just kind of had to wait and find out to see, if there, I guess, was an issue or not. So I actually went to a hearing school. There was no sign language interpreter at that time. There was no deaf school. And they had not passed the ADA. It's so small. Sorry, my screen is very small, so bear with me here. At that time, they had not passed the IDEA, which is an educational act for people with disabilities. And now, obviously, you can see that I have an interpreter on the screen or on the iPad here, or through the technology or through the Zoom app. So you can see that we've come a long way with that. So there's definitely, and obviously, I'm able actually to get access to certified and qualified interpreters nationwide anytime that I'm needing one. I actually now have access to those certified interpreters. But in the past, at that time, it was considered like a signer. It wasn't really considered like a sign language interpreter. It wasn't really a profession or even a career until later on at that time. So I had a quote unquote signer, and that's kind of how, and actually that signer had started at church. And so, sorry, I missed it there. So I eventually, sorry, can we go back? You had said that you had a signer, right? So, excuse me. So most of the people that were quote unquote interpreting for me at school were signers from my church or from a church that I was attending. And that's basically how I had access to communication at that time. And that's just kind of how my education and communication transferred with time. So I would have a signer from church that would come to school, but there was no like actual interpreting training or interpreter training programs. That wasn't available like until about the 1970s or maybe even closer to the 1980s. We started to see more interpreting programs become available nationwide at that time. But it was really when the ADA or when the law was passed in 1990 that you really started to see a lot more advocacy and a lot more instruction, or I guess a lot more language, I should say, in the ADA that had mentioned having access to a qualified sign language interpreter, someone that can receptively understand the language, someone that can remain neutral, that can remove their biases and judgments. So just someone that's, I guess, considered a professional, and that was helped to be passed in the ADA. And also confidentiality was an issue as well. Prior to the ADA, I mean, you'd have people that were quote unquote signers who did not really adhere to confidentiality or anything of that nature. So there was a lot of gossip, a lot of information that wasn't kept private as far as your information went. But now with the ADA being passed, and especially here in Nebraska, for the state of Nebraska, we have laws and legislation, we have specific language that actually requires interpreters to be certified and licensed. So we have licensed interpreters and certified interpreters. A licensed interpreter means that they are required to remain confidential, and they're required to basically just remain a professional, neutral interpreter. So whether they're interpreting for medical or if they're involved in court, maybe they're involved with law enforcement, things of that nature. There's also different levels of certification. So I won't get into explaining all of the certification requirements, but we really have come such a long ways when it comes to interpreting services, and also with just the community here. You know, that really didn't start here until like maybe 2015, maybe about 5 years ago, where we really started developing more laws for like state agencies, law enforcement, court, and things of that nature. So when it comes to police specifically, I want to say it was 1979. It was roughly around there. They actually finally started requiring licensed interpreters. Before you could just be anybody, anybody who could basically move their hands and say, hey, if you can wiggle your fingers, you can move your hands, you can be an interpreter. And now they actually do require it to be certified or licensed. So we are making some progress when it comes to access for communication, obviously, and having that access to communication is so highly valuable and important. And really technology too. Back in the day, we didn't have access to phones. We weren't able to use the phone because we couldn't hear over the telephone. So oftentimes we had to depend on our children to make phone calls. So can you just imagine a little 3 or 4-year-old interpreting over the phone for your conversation? I mean, you can about imagine how well that would go if you're making a phone call to the doctor's office. There was lots of scary things that would happen with the interpretation of the information, because you're relying on a young individual to give you the information. So finally, when they did pass the ADA, we just felt like we had more access to different kinds of services, you know, basically to like the telephone, and just basically how other people were communicating. You know, for example, with the relay service, I didn't have to rely on friends or family to communicate for me. I could rely on the relay service. And if you actually could not afford a telephone, as many people could not afford because we had to have special equipment. So maybe if there was, you know, someone that could hear in your family, you could depend on them to call you. But oftentimes you would have to maybe also depend on people to drive you to the doctor's office or drive you to like the electric company. If you had an issue with your bills, then you'd have to drive there, and then you'd have to call your friend or family member and figure out a time they could give you a ride and all those things. Or maybe if you just wanted to go visit a friend or something like that, we always had to first kind of write a letter, give them a heads up saying, hey, you know, here's the day and time that I'm planning to come, and just to give you a heads up. And most of the time when it came to the deaf community, what was this? Oh, to like, if you're outside their window because you know if you're visiting a deaf friend, you're trying to get their attention, so you're waving your hands around, hoping that they'll see you because you obviously want to come in and visit and hang out with your friend and have a good chat, right? We didn't really have technology. I mean, technology was quote unquote physical. It was so visual back then of how you had to get a hold of people. Maybe sometimes you'd flash your lights to get people's attention, or you'd have to find a way to wake up in the morning, and you'd have to find a way to have vibrators like that would shake your bed or shake your pillow to wake you up. So technology has come such a long ways compared to how it used to be, especially when it comes to movies. You know, back in the day, there was no closed captioning. So, or not even just going to movies, but if you're watching the TV, it was extremely limited. And about in the 1970s, 1980s, there was some limited captioning that started to become available, but it was still a huge struggle with accuracy and having full access to communication through the closed captioning. And I'm finally starting to see more of that happening. And there was actually a lawsuit that occurred that one of the agencies had filed a lawsuit against Netflix because they had recognized that, hey, this is not working. You know, this is for, I'm sorry, ADA, what? For the ADA for Title III, this is what they sued under, or what their lawsuit was based under. They went to the court and the judge had recognized that, you know, they were not compliant with Title III of the ADA, and that they had to basically, how it used to work is that you'd have to download a movie first, and then hopefully there would be closed captioning provided with that. But the point was to make technology kind of equal. And sometimes the captioning does not always work. There has been a lot of improvement, but sometimes you have to download it first to get the closed captioning instead of live streaming. But I know that there's been many lawsuits when it comes to providing live captioning and closed captioning and making sure that there's accuracy with that. So, before the ADA actually, again, had been passed, there was such limited access to higher education and attending college. You know, what was I going to do without having a sign language interpreter? And I really had limited options about where I was going to go. I was either going to go to New York. At that time, New York had the National Technical Institute for Deaf and Hard of Hearing, which was NRET, and that was in Rochester, New York. That was one option as a deaf individual that you could attend, which was RET. It was a popular option. They had an interpreter program. They had deaf instructors that you could speak with directly. There was Gallaudet in Washington, D.C. There was also another community college in Texas. And that one was a little bit limited, though. I mean, they had good aspirations. You know, if you were wanting to become a doctor or a lawyer or maybe a veterinarian or, you know, a dentist or maybe a nurse, they really had limited options. Or excuse me, as for a deaf individual, you had limited options of where you could go because you had to make sure that you had communication access. So we basically had 3 programs that you could choose from. So RIT, Gallaudet, and then the one in Texas. But after the ADA passed, this just opened up a huge array of colleges that you could attend because now we had captioning services that you could access. Before we didn't have that. And we also started recognizing sign language interpreting services as well. And so you had all of these different options that you could start attending compared to prior to that. There was another place called, and this was for Creighton University, just recently here at Creighton. I actually want to say it was back in 2012. They had dealt with a lawsuit for not providing captioning services for deaf and hard of hearing people. There was a deaf individual who relied on the oral method, and he wanted to become a doctor of some sort, and they were not providing that access. He actually took them to court or filed a lawsuit, and he did win. He won that lawsuit. So that was a huge victory for our community and seeing that progress. And now today it's amazing. We have so much access to all kinds of different, you know, community resources, if it's medical, if it's, you know, I guess something to do with the law, if it's court, law enforcement, things of that nature. We just feel like we actually finally are starting to see some of that access. So I really appreciate, you know, even just having the captioning services available or the interpreter. So that way, if I can't see the interpreter, I can maybe look at the captioning services, or vice versa. I can go to, rely on either or if I'm having an issue. So it's nice that I also have the option to turn that on or off for the captioning services if I'm just relying on the interpreter. So it's really nice that I can have that. And so for our planning committee, I also appreciate you guys inviting me to come and speak, and I just appreciate your invitation as well.
There's a question for Kim. Do hospitals have interpreters on staff?
In Omaha, yes. At CHI Hospital does have staff interpreters. Yes, they do. They are actually, if you look under CHI, under their particular program, you can see that they do have that. There are other hospitals that are, you know, will call and look for referral services to provide interpreters as well. So they do have access to providing interpreters. They just have to get that connection made. we also have set up a system where they're able to send a text to a specific department and request an interpreter as well. But there are lots of hospitals in the area that have that information for contact so that they can provide those captioning services as well as sign language interpreters in the hospital. And say, for an example, the cancer hospital, they have done just an absolute stellar job of providing access. And we've got quite an influx of requests coming in. And so we're continually sending out those interpreters for those folks.
Well,
I have a friend who was in the hospital and was unable to get a phone that could be used with hearing aids. Do people at the hospitals know that whether those are available or not?
That's a good question. Many times the equipment that they have at the hospital is more of like an amplified type equipment. And so it is not necessarily going to increase the amount of sound that is coming in for that person. But what they can do is they can contact our agency and they can borrow a phone from our agency that would be able to provide that increase in volume as well. So we are also responsible for educating those outside of our department or our commission what is available in regards to equipment and technology. If there's a time when a person is stuck for that communication access, they are able to contact us and we're able to have several solutions to offer them.
This person was told that they didn't have any equipment, so some of the hospitals might need more education. From D, are interpreters understaffed? Are there enough?
Well, providing interpreters are a challenge to find anywhere throughout the United States. So nationwide, it is a challenge, as I mentioned, to find a sign language interpreter. You have to understand as well that if there is a possibility of scheduling that interpreter ahead of time, that does increase your chances of being able to get an interpreter for that event. If you need someone last minute, that can be quite a challenge, yes. Luckily, we were able to find one on short notice.
Megan wants to know if there are efforts at the state level to increase the number of hearing loop systems in public areas.
Well, that depends on the hard of hearing people, the deaf and hard of hearing people that are advocating for those services. I know that there is one area that was advocating for caption services, and there was also a request for ability to hear more clearly because there was so much background noise coming in. It was too noisy of an environment for certain options to work. In church services also, they do have those systems, but it is something that our community has to advocate for. We have to educate and we have to provide the resources. And the best way that you can do that, to advocate for that, is to contact us directly and to just keep advocating all over for everything ADA and just keep moving forward and keep going. We can't just sit back and let things happen to us and be passive. We have to throw that passive model of behavior out, and we have to become assertive, and we have to speak out, and we have to do that together, right?
How is the use of masks presenting a problem?
I'm sorry, this is the interpreter. I think I might have missed part of the question.
Okay. How is the use of masks impacting the deaf community?
It is a challenge. When you depend on facial expression, movements of the mouth, smiles, frowns, grimaces, what have you, it's very difficult to communicate only through the eyes, because you're of course, with masks, you're only able to see from the eyes up. And so it has made it harder. I know some people really depend on mouth movements to be able to lip read and to get the full message. And you might not even depend on lip reading, but there's so much of our grammar on our face that if you don't have the mouth part, you'll miss what the meaning is. But we do have these. These are one option. You know, the clear masks. Those help being able to see the mouth movements in the full face. These are a little bit harder. And they do fog up a bit, so that's been a problem as well. And then we have this option, the face shield, which is again a clear shield. So we are encouraging the use of something visual. I mean, there are a lot of us that depend on that visual information in order to be able to successfully communicate with each other. So a clear mask is a benefit for all of us, absolutely.
For those who might not be able to see Kim, she was showing a couple of versions of the clear face masks. And Megan says, Janie York with Here Now is making clear masks available. And the website is in the chat box for everyone.
And on that note, I'm just gonna have to let this end so that Diane Dallaire can speak now. And Diane is going to talk.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kim, for everything.
Absolutely.
Diane is going to talk to us about Olmsted, which is another very important part of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So I believe Diane's here now, right?
I'm here, Kathy.
Oh, thank you. I'd like to introduce you to Diane Dallaire. I'll let her introduce herself.
Well, hi, everybody, and thank you. It's an honor to speak here today, celebrating 30 years of the Americans with Disabilities Act. As Kathy said, my name is Diane Dallaire, and I'm the senior staff attorney with Disability Rights Nebraska, and that's our state's protection and advocacy organization. And a big chunk of our work is work that we do under the Americans with Disabilities Act and enforcing the ADA. So it's just great to talk to you today about a very important U.S. Supreme Court decision called LC versus Olmsted. And you may have heard Olmsted, bounced around. And I want to just briefly talk today just about how important that U.S. Supreme Court decision was. And we're celebrating 30 years of the ADA today. Last year, 2019, was the 20th anniversary of the Olmsted decision. And I'll talk a little bit more about that historic case. So before we go into what the Olmsted case was and why that decision was important, I think it's a good idea to do just a refresher of the different titles of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So as we know, Title I of the ADA prohibits discrimination based on employment. Title II prohibits discrimination based on, prohibits discrimination in state and local governments, services, policies, things of that nature. Title III of the ADA prohibits discrimination in places of public accommodations. So your restaurants, movie theaters, doctor's office, lawyer's office. And as Kim Davis had mentioned during her presentation, Title IV, and we don't talk much about Title IV of the ADA, but that involves telecommunications, and that requires telecommunication companies offering services to the public to provide relay services. So going back to when the Americans with Disabilities was passed, and we saw that great photo of President Bush and Justin Dart and other folks who advocated for the passage of the ADA. I just wanted to read a little bit about what Congress found when they were debating the Americans with Disabilities Act, and why are we passing this? And Congress noted in its findings that a central purpose of the ADA is to address the historical isolation and segregation of individuals with disabilities and to prevent their unnecessary institutionalization. Congress also found that this history rendered persons with disabilities a discrete and insular minority entitled to the same deferential analysis of federally protected rights as other similar minorities. And to achieve this purpose and redress this historical segregation, Congress enacted Title II of the ADA, which included a federal right to be free of unnecessary institutionalization and to live in the most integrated setting possible. So we have the ADA passed in 1990, and then in 1999, a little case, or a big case, from the state of Georgia made its way up to the US Supreme Court. And LC versus Olmstead was brought on behalf of two individuals with psychiatric and intellectual disabilities to challenge their unnecessary segregation in a Georgia mental institution. Both women were very clear about their desire to leave the institution. In fact, LC, in that LC stands for Lois Curtis. She was one of the named plaintiffs. She pleaded on a daily, sometimes hourly basis to be released from the hospital into the community. And I do have a little photo here. I think sometimes when we talk about Olmstead, it's really important that we remember, these brave women and the attorney from Legal Aid of Georgia who brought this very important suit. So, Olmstead has often been referred to as important of a case in the civil rights movement for people with disabilities as Brown versus Board of Education. And Olmstead affirmed the right of disabled Americans to spend their days in integrated settings in their own homes rather than shut away from society, interacting with non-disabled people, not as clients or patients, but as peers and fellow members of the community. Now, the decision applied the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA's integration regulation, which requires states to administer services, programs, and activities in the most integrated setting appropriate to the needs of qualified individuals with disabilities. And the US Supreme Court upheld the right of two Georgia women with disabilities, that's Lois Curtis, who I mentioned, and Elaine Wilson, to receive treatment and other services outside of state hospitals and institutions. And Jill Flegel mentioned during her presentation that when the ADA was passed in 1990, that a switch just wasn't flipped. Things didn't change overnight. And that's really true with the Olmstead decision and what occurred years later. This was a giant victory for Lois Curtis and Elaine Wilson. But this decision was to have great ramifications in other areas. So the traditional Olmstead decision, we think about if someone can be served in the community and they don't oppose that, and they're in a very institutional segregated setting, they have a right to receive those services in the community. Well, since Olmsted, since the Olmsted decision, there's been a wave of litigation across our country extending that integration mandate to other types of settings. So for example, in the area of privately run assisted living facilities, that's what we call them here in Nebraska, but for example, in New York, they are called board and care homes. And there was a significant case back in 2009 where the court said that, you know, just because the state doesn't actually own and operate these private board and care facilities for people with mental illness, the ADA and Title II extends to them. Those protections extend to the individuals because the state license those types of facilities. And also the way that the mental health system is set up, it tends to segregate people into these very institutional type settings. And that's a violation of ADA Title II. So if you operate a policy or a practice, you know, that can also implicate the protections under the ADA via the Olmsted decision. You know, since that time, we've also seen this extended to employment settings for people with developmental disabilities. There was a case in Oregon, which the court found there that the state relied too heavily on sheltered workshops, and people really didn't have a choice. There were no offerings or not enough substantial offerings of employment training opportunities in the community. And so when I say the community, the actual community, not sheltered workshops or, you know, jobs where you would go into the community and you would be with other people with disabilities doing a certain job. So what the court found in that instance is that, okay, Oregon, you're offering these workshops, but we want to see an increase in supported employment and the services to enable people to do that. And so this is significant because we've gone past the initial decision in LC versus Olmsted, and extending those integration mandate rights just a little bit further. So while the decision didn't necessarily flip a switch in 1999, the years since then, the hard work of advocates all across the US to prevent discrimination, isolation, and segregation has really enacted further protections for people with disabilities, especially in the community. And I know education has been mentioned, and so an analogy that I like to think about is that, well, the ADA, it requires schools to possibly build ramps or ways for you know, kids to get into the school. But okay, you can get into the school, but are you being segregated within your education? Are you being sent to a room where it's only kids with disabilities, or you are isolated, you know, in a learning skills class all day? So you're not really part of the community of general education of other kids, where those interactions are so important, especially when we talk about attitudes and inclusive education. Starting off young, that's how we learn to live together, and don't you know, treat people as separate and keeping them far away. So that's just a brief little intro discussion about the Olmsted decision. It is important. It continues to evolve, and it's it was just very groundbreaking. And I'm just really happy to be able to talk about Olmsted today with all of you.
Comments in the chat box. One person said they looked up a lot of information on Olmsted. Sarvinos, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, needs some help fighting discrimination based on segregation and isolation against higher institution. DRN, Disability Rights Nebraska, helped with the process, but because of the lack of funding, couldn't fight all the way. Just wondering, I moved on, but think fighting against unequal treatment would benefit many more students to come. Exactly what we are discussing, funding, not just against physical and obviously visible disability, but many hidden disabilities. And another comment from Ashley, could the state of Nebraska be sued for not implementing an Olmsted plan?
Yes, I could have intentionally didn't mention the Homestead Plan just because it does take a little bit longer to explain. But so back in 2016, our state legislature passed a bill that required Health and Human Services to develop and implement what's called an Olmsted Plan. So going back to the decision in Olmsted, Elsie versus Olmsted, the court said further in the decision that, okay, we realize states, you can't make all of these changes overnight. We want you to go back and look at where there are gaps in your capacity to serve people in the most integrated setting and put together a plan on how you're going to do this. And a lot of states, you know, did this just sort of on the surface. Some states did enact eventually Olmsted plans that had 5 to 7, years. Some of the courts have approved that. Nebraska did submit its Olmsted plan in December of 2019, and we feel that on the whole, that it does not meet legal muster, and that the state of Nebraska is still vulnerable to federal litigation under ADA and Olmsted. And just to mention the Creighton case, that was Michael Argani versus Creighton Medical School. And that was a case that I actually filed back in 2009 against Creighton Medical School for violations of the ADA and Section 504. But we had help. We had the National Association of the Deaf partner with us, along with the law firm of Stein and Vargas from Baltimore.
And Dee says that she started a suit against Nebraska. The Department of Justice attorney called to get in additional information and is moving forward.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you repeat the question?
It's not a question, it's a statement. Dee says she started a suit against Nebraska. Department of Justice attorney has called and asked for additional information and is moving forward. And then MT said, can Disability Rights Nebraska help with discrimination in post-secondary institution?
Yes, that would be something that Disability Rights Nebraska would take a look at. And if you have additional questions about the type of services that we offer or the cases that we take, you can go to our website, disabilityrightsnebraska.org. But we would definitely take a look at the fact situation for post-secondary education under the ADA.
Well, Diane, I would like to thank you very much for providing us with such good information. And I want to thank Jill and Kim again also for spending time with us and answering some great questions. Tomorrow our topic for today will be education. So I hope some people will come back to join us tomorrow, and hopefully we'll have the technology running better than we do today.